I quit Deloitte. I declined a great job offer, and I realised who I am. I spent 4.5 years at Deloitte between 2020 and 2024. It was Deloitte UK. It was based in Bristol, in a very small corner of Deloitte called TechWorks. And I had a blast. I had a fantastic time. I met some wonderful people, worked on some great projects. But in February of 2024, I made the decision to quit. And it was a big decision. It was a huge decision. You know, Deloitte had been fantastic for me, for my family, for my career. So I think what had happened had accumulated over the 4 years. And like a lot of things, it didn't just happen overnight. I needed a change. I knew that I needed a change both personally and professionally. At the beginning of 2020, when I began working for Deloitte, I think I started in the February of 2020, I began working full-time in the office in Bristol. I did a wonderful induction, met lots of new colleagues. At the time, my wife was in the earlier stages of pregnancy. And within 4 weeks, I think, of beginning at Deloitte, lockdown happened in the UK due to the outbreak of COVID. And I think was it the 13th of March 2020, everything changed. We were still trying to work and operate. In fact, I remember I was in an office late in the day. I think it was past 5 p.m. We were working on a proposal that we were going to take to the Met Office to try to win some work. I was surrounded by some very senior people in Deloitte, partners and directors, senior managers. And we stood there in the kind of waiting area of the offices and watched on the TV as Boris Johnson kind of announced that there was going to be a lockdown. My wife and I immediately had a kind of quick messaging chat, and the consensus in the room was that, you know, regardless of the lockdown being imminent, we would as a team still go down to Exeter, travel to a city a little bit further south than Bristol. We'd still travel down the next day to pitch this proposal to the Met Office in person. But my wife and I, after a quick conversation, you know, we realised that this wasn't an option for us. You know, my wife obviously was in a vulnerable way, and not only that, but obviously our unborn child was also vulnerable for all we knew. And so I announced at the table, you know, to these kind of senior colleagues at Deloitte, that my wife was pregnant and that I was not willing, you know, to make the trip. And they totally and completely respected and understood that. And so the next day, you know, a small group of them went down. I videoed in, so I kind of linked up. I was still part of the pitch, still part of the proposal, and that was the beginning of lockdown. That was the beginning of lockdown, and it was fast and furious. I've never worked such long hours in all my life. I was on a project for HSBC during those lockdown months, up until my daughter was born, and even afterwards as well. Our daughter was born in the June of 2020, and I got to be as involved, you know, and be there at the birth as I ever would have, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. And yeah, by the July, I was back onto a a COVID project, working for Deloitte to help administer business loans for companies who were not able to continue to work. And so we were administering and helping financial institutions to administer loans to these companies. And that was 2020. That's how it really began. That was, that's what my first few months at Deloitte looked like. We had a fantastic community of people around us. And despite me only spending a month in the office in Bristol, I got to know people very well. And we were all in it together. I think a lot of the time these types of things really can unify people, can't they? They can bring you tighter together. And we were a relatively small community at that time of about 60 people in that particular Bristol office in TechWorks. And we supported each other. We worked really, really hard on some great projects, built a lot of things in a very short amount of time. And I'm incredibly grateful, for being able to continue to work, and also for having so much time with my family at such a crucial time. Yes, it was tough, but we all dug in and kind of got through it together. Our daughter Nina was born. Our son Joshua was 3.5 at the time. We were all in one house. We were all trying to work in what we had, mainly in the corners of bedrooms, and we made it work. 2021 was a bit different. 2021 was pretty tough. My father was a carer for my mum and had been for some years after she'd had a traumatic brain injury in 2016. He was also a carer for my mum because she was alcoholic, and that meant that ultimately he was there to try to protect her. And despite them getting through lockdown together and doing it in a fantastic way, my dad's health deteriorated, and in the December of 2021 my dad died. And that came as a surprise, despite the fact that my dad had been ill and had numerous kind of things going wrong. He'd had a couple of really successful surgeries earlier in 2021. But sadly, it wasn't until he went in for heart surgery in the September of that year that he really struggled to recover. And a procedure they needed to do for pancreatic cancer became untenable. And then everything escalated and he died of multi-organ failure. That left my mum without a carer, and things became very difficult. The beginning of 2021, my sister and I essentially tried to look after my mum's care from afar. But my mum didn't want that. She didn't want to be cared for. Obviously, she was grieving for my dad. And she was doing that in the only way she knew how, which was on her own and with alcohol. And so things began to get very, very tough from the day that my dad died onwards. In fact, within 24 hours of my dad dying, I was back in the hospital that my dad had died, sitting beside my mum on a ward because she'd had a seizure brought on from drinking. And so we were sat probably on the level above the mortuary of the hospital where my dad was lying. And that began a very tough couple of years where my sister, who lived probably an hour away from my mum, and me, who lives probably 3.5, 4 hours away from my mum, were trying our best to keep her alive. But we were trying to keep her alive when she didn't really want to be alive anymore. You know, she didn't want to be here anymore. And so I did my best with work, and work did their best with me. You know, Deloitte, you know, were absolutely fantastic with me. They supported me. They gave me a lot of time to grieve. They gave me, you know, compassionate leave, and they helped me to kind of, you know, ramp back up into work. So it was a phased return. And I did that really quite successfully, I think, after my dad died. I think it, you know, they also allowed me to work flexibly and remotely, which was incredible, because it meant that if I did need to drop things and go to my mum, maybe she'd had a fall, or maybe she'd had an accident, or maybe we just didn't know, then I could jump in the car and I could go, and I could take my laptop with me, and I could, you know, for all intents and purposes, just get working, you know, at my mum's while trying to manage and care for her. Then in early 2024, my mum's health deteriorated to the point whereby she was no longer mobile. And despite our best efforts, you know, my mum just didn't accept the help that we were trying to give her, and the help that we were trying to get from, you know, third-party organisations and carers. And my mum died. Before my mum died, however, you know, I realised that I needed a change. I think the 4 years at Deloitte had coincided with 4 of the most difficult years personally that I'd ever had. And I'm a true believer that we carry it with us. You know, I don't think it's that easy just to empty your rucksack of stress and trauma quickly. You know, I think that we carry it with us, and I was carrying an awful lot with me. And despite, you know, how fantastically supportive Deloitte were, you know, I'd been on a project with Deloitte for 3.5 years, which was a world-class project where I got to work with world-class software engineers. But I was well out my comfort zone. You know, I had to work extremely hard, both because of my kind of limited skill level, but also because of everything else going on in my life. I had to work extremely hard to keep up. And although on paper it looked like I was thriving, you know, I'd been promoted twice in 2 years at Deloitte, which was unheard of, you know, and I was told many times that I had to do 2 years in role to be promoted. And I proved that wrong, not once, but twice. But despite that, you know, I was, and in order to achieve that, I was having to work extremely hard, and I was exhausted. I was tired. I was done. I needed a change. You know, I needed a change. I think, you know, a partner at Deloitte once said to me, about a year into my tenure, when I was talking to him about the opportunity to go onto a new project, he said, it is good to spend time out of your comfort zone sometimes, but you've got to be careful of staying there too long. And I think that's where I was. I was staying out of my comfort zone for far too long. I just felt like I was drowning in it. I didn't feel like my learning trajectory was going up any. I just felt like I was in a bit of a vicious cycle, and I needed to break that. And I feel like I needed to work towards my strengths far more than I was. And one of those big strengths was leadership. I think I am a natural leader. I listen to people. I create space for people, and I take responsibility for others around me. I try to look after those around me, and I'm very fortunate that people are willing to follow me. People look to me for leadership, and they look to me to make decisions, and that's probably what I was enjoying the most, but doing the least. I was still very much an individual contributor at Deloitte, which meant that I was spending a lot of time doing technical work when my strengths really were more aligned to pastoral and cultural work. And so before my mum died in the February of 24, I decided that enough was enough. I'd asked for a transfer. I'd asked to change projects within Deloitte. I spoke to a number of different people to try and make this happen. I spoke to different partners, but sadly, Deloitte just were not in the position they had been a couple of years prior. The market was having a really tough time, and there weren't the new opportunities coming through the door that we all would have liked. And so, nobody was to blame. It's just the fact that Deloitte couldn't offer me what I wanted, and what I needed, which was a leadership position in a different project, ideally in something that, I really felt strongly about, such as health or fitness. And so, I got to the stage where I thought, well, this is what I need to do. And I handed in my resignation at the end of February. And at that time, I think, looking after my mum was more intense than it ever had been. I wasn't to know at the time that my mum would die, because during the course of the 2 years prior, things had been very, very bad, and at times extremely critical. But I just knew that I needed a change. And as it happened, as soon as I handed my resignation in, everything really escalated and accelerated, and my mum's health deteriorated hugely. And so we spent an awful lot of time in the March and the April with my mum in hospital, in and out of hospital, until the point when, she went into hospital for the last time. And she died on the 1st of May, 2024. And that was exactly 1 month until the end of my notice period. So I spent the entirety, really, of my notice period at Deloitte caring for my mum, and then, the final month, grieving my mum, and trying my best to pick up the pieces. I went back into Deloitte a week before my final day. It was important to me. Like, I wanted to represent my people. I was people leader to 4 colleagues who I care for, and who I wanted to develop, and I wanted to see them prosper. And so I went back to receive their year-end results, which essentially means, whether or not they've been promoted, how much bonus they might have received and what their salary is going to change to. So I went back for that last week. I hadn't been in Deloitte for a couple of months, really. I'd been off on leave, caring for my mother and, as I say, then grieving for my mum. And so I went back to find these results out for the first time, and I was disappointed. I was disappointed for my people, probably far more disappointed than they were. We didn't quite get the results, that I certainly wanted for them. And it was a reminder, sadly. It was a reminder that actually, in huge corporate organizations, reward and recognition is not always possible, and it doesn't always align with the effort, of the people involved. Sadly, of course, there's lots of other things that come into play, lots of other factors. It very much depends upon economics a lot of the time, the bottom line of the business. Sometimes, more specifically, it could be about the number of people at a particular role as to whether or not you receive a bonus or whether you get that promotion. And so, yeah, it was a tough week, considering it was my last. I tried my best to say the goodbyes that I wanted to. But also as well, there were difficult conversations. Some people obviously weren't to know that my mum had died, and so I was telling them for the first time in a goodbye phone call, which was tough for them, and tough for me. And that was it. And then I left, and I hadn't given the first thought to what I was going to do after Deloitte. I hadn't given a thought to my next position, my next job, because I'd been all in. I'd been caring for my mum and then caring about the funeral, organising the funeral and supporting my sister, supporting my family, supporting my kids. So yeah, like June began of 2024, and and it was good. It was, I was fortunate. I was very fortunate. I was in a great, really privileged position to be able to have a bit of a runway, have some savings that meant that I didn't need to panic straight away. So during that month, I applied for a couple of jobs that looked really good, and I applied for one in particular that I was successful in. So I got a job offer after, I think, maybe 3 or 4 rounds of interview. I got an offer to be essentially the head of software engineering for a team of about 12 engineers. It was in industry, so it wasn't consulting like Deloitte. It was a much smaller kind of company. But it was really like an engineering manufacturing company that happened to do software. And so a lot of their working policies and ways of working were born out of manufacturing, and a lot of their employees had and still are essentially factory workers. And so the contract that I received was very unlike what we're used to in software engineering, and certainly, very different to ways of working in somewhere like Deloitte. And so that meant that in terms of employment policies and employment benefits and employment rights, the contract I received was just left wanting. It was very rigid and really showed for me a complete lack of care for the employees. And so after receiving the contract through from their HR for me to sort of sign and agree to, I then had what was essentially just a formality, which was a conversation with their CTO at the time. And I asked the CTO about this, and I said, like, you know, what's the score with the contract? Like, you know, why are these policies so rigid, and you know, why do they not account for you know, very standard benefits, really, you know? And what I was talking about here is, like, you know, they had statutory kind of sick pay. They didn't, I don't even think they mentioned grievance or compassionate leave. I don't think that was a thing. I don't think they bought into like new policies around maternity leave or paternity leave. It was almost as if, I don't think it had changed for what could have been, I don't know, a couple of decades. Like it really did seem archaic, and it seemed as if it had been quite ignored, really. And the CTO didn't really have an answer. They didn't have a response. They didn't, you know, they weren't really very aware of it. And then it became apparent to me that the things that mattered to me certainly don't matter to other people. And that's fine, that's okay. But it reminded me of what I value. And I value support, you know, I value love. I value integrity as well. And I think that whereas maybe other people find the salary of a job the most important thing, for me now at this period of my life, the most important thing is having the knowledge, that the comfort of knowing that if I'm going to work for someone, that they've got my back, you know, that they will support me when life happens, because of course it has, and I know what that feels like. And that's one thing that, you know, I will never forget with Deloitte, and I cannot overestimate how important that was. Deloitte were true to their values, you know, of looking after one another, and that's reflected in the policies and the ways of working. And there's no reason, there's no excuse why other organisations can't do that. You know, they can talk about Deloitte's size and infrastructure and whatever it may be, but it doesn't cost anything to look after your people. In fact, actually, there's a return on investment for looking after your people, because they're more likely to stay for longer, they'll be loyal to you, they'll work harder. So it was really sad. And that's when it struck me, and I thought, actually, I'm not willing to, you know, work for an organisation that doesn't value its people, and therefore doesn't share the same values as me. So I declined it. And I went off, you know, on summer holiday for 2024, and I switched off and I forgot all about it, and I didn't apply for jobs for a couple of months. I just took a break. And then at the end of last year, September 2024, I decided to go back to learning. So I went back to the old coding boot camp where I had originally learnt to code in 2018, and I took a course in data science and machine learning, which is something that I knew I needed, you know, in my skill set. I learned Python, the coding language, and I learned data analytics. I learned how to create a machine learning model, and this was a massive thing. This is it was great to add that to my skills, and it felt great to learn again. While I was doing this, I reconnected with my old tutor at the coding bootcamp, who I discovered was actually leaving, was actually moving on after 10 years. I couldn't believe it. And we got into conversation. He said, like the coding bootcamp, we don't know where it's going to go or what's going to happen to it. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the parent company of the coding bootcamp, they've been bought out by private equity. They don't want this bootcamp anymore. They got no purpose for it. The reason why it was built in the first place was for homegrown talent. It was essentially because the parent company was trying to recruit junior software engineers and couldn't find any, couldn't recruit any. And so one of the software engineers said, you know what? Let's take on people who want to learn. I'll teach them how to become a software engineer, within 4 months, and then they can work for the company. And it was amazing. It was brilliant. It turned into a monster, turned into an academy all in its own right. There was a trading arm of the parent company. They didn't just train junior developers for their own business, but they then created a business out of it, and a coding academy, a coding bootcamp in its own right. And so that's how it happened. That's how it was born. But now the parent company had been bought out. They had no real reason for this coding academy. That they could recruit people, no problem. And and so the board of directors had decided that they were gonna, in one way or another, they were gonna get rid of this coding academy. And so, cut a long story short, for the final 3 months of 2024, I entered into talks to purchase the academy. And it was on me. It was just as a solo founder, as a solo purchaser. And the director of the parent company, who was taking this on, was incredibly generous with his time, his knowledge, his patience, and he went out to tender to other learning and teaching providers who were looking to purchase, and whittled it down, shortlisted them, and in the December 2024, turned around to me and said, actually, you know what, we'd like you to purchase the academy. We signed a heads of terms. I got everything in place. I employed corporate lawyers to do due diligence, and then I instructed an accountant to do the work that I needed, and we were all good to go. And from the 1st of January 2025, I was set up to be the new owner of this academy. After purchasing it for a very modest amount, and 2Ping across, so essentially transferring across 3 out of the 5 members of staff, and 2 of them were going to be seconded back to the parent company while we tried to gain some momentum and get the revenue in the coding bootcamp back up to where it needed to be. The week before Christmas 2024, I began to go into the academy. I began to meet with the members of staff individually and as a group, and that was brilliant. They were really wonderful, talented people. Sadly, what I discovered in these conversations was that the figures that I had, the revenue projections that I had, were inaccurate, and it was no one's fault. It was simply that things had changed. Students who were booked on in 2025, in quarter 1 of 2025, had changed their agreement. So it could be, for example, that some of them deferred their start date. It could be that some of them cancelled altogether. Some students were moving from paying in full to paying part payment over a period of time. And that essentially meant that the revenue projections that kind of I had in place just no longer worked. They no longer made sense. You know, I was going to leverage and borrow quite a substantial amount of money to make this work. And what I really wanted to see from the academy was that business as usual over the first 2 quarters of 2025 could at least pull in and match pound for pound the money, my own money, that I was going to be putting into the business. And sadly, it just didn't add up anymore. And they were big ticket items. So, for example, you know, one student who's going on a full stack coding bootcamp could be paying £12,000 for that course, and they could be paying up front to do that. And so if you've got, you know, a full paying student who's paying up front, that's fantastic, because that's probably 50% of that 1 month's overheads, you know, to pay the trainers and to keep the academy kind of alive and to keep the lights on. So you've already, you know, within that full payment is a really big thing, and it was a big thing to lose. And so those people who were deferring or who decided that they weren't able to pay up front, you know, that really massively affected each one of those students, hugely affected the revenue projection and the bottom line. And so reluctantly, I had to try to make a decision for me and my family, you know, and I wanted to try and keep stress out of our family as much as I possibly could. And the idea of a huge amount of debt hanging over me and my family personally, you know, was too much of a risk in the end, when I just didn't think it was going to, you know, that revenue was going to come in. And so day before Christmas, I made the phone call, very, very difficult phone call. I had the business terms, you know, the business agreement in hand, and it was all good to go. It was all good to sign. And day before Christmas, I made the call to the director and withdrew, you know, and sadly, that academy has now gone on to wind up the academy, and the academy is no more, which is devastating. You know, I'm absolutely gutted. Like, I'm hugely believe in the academy. You know, it changed the course of my life. You know, I switched careers from sport, health and fitness into software, and I've never looked back. You know, it's given me and my family a wonderful life, and I've met many, many wonderful people because of it. And I really kind of put it down to that academy being the catapult, I think, that helped me to do that. So yeah, the idea of it now closing, you know, it is devastating. And I think knowing that I was so close to me being able to save it is quite painful as well. And so January 2025, you know, beginning of this year, like, I kind of woke up on New Year's Day and I kind of thought, right, okay, wow, what's next? You know, what's next? I'd learned an awful lot from trying to purchase the academy, but as I say, I'd also invested an awful lot of time, an awful lot of energy, some of my savings. And so I had less runway, but, you know, I had a wide open door of opportunity. And so I began back on the job hunting treadmill in January 2025, and got myself a few interviews again, So I had 3 kind of interviews, consecutive weeks in January, which was good. I was building momentum. But I got into these interviews and I just found that my heart just wasn't in it. I was getting to a point in every interview where I was almost having this out of body experience, like, what am I doing here? Like, and they were all for engineering leadership positions, software engineering leadership positions. On the resume, on the spec, on the job advert, they all looked good. They tick the boxes, do you know what I mean? Like, I wasn't applying for anything that I didn't think I was suited for, and I wasn't applying for anything that I didn't think suited me. There was nothing on the job spec that worried me or that I hadn't seen before or done before. But I'm not sure, I don't know what it was. Maybe the job spec didn't completely cover what the organisations really wanted. Maybe they were looking for a few different things. So, for example, in one interview, I remember them asking me about cloud migration. So this is, so cloud in terms of cloud storage, software storage. And, as a software engineer, I have experience of overseeing cloud storage, but I certainly don't have like hands-on experience with that. And my CV that I would have sent them would clearly not have shown, any cloud migration or, cloud storage experience. That is very much a specialism in its own right. And it hadn't been on the job advert, and so I found myself being asked this question. I thought, okay, well, I'm curious about this. Like, why? Yeah, I just said, like, can I ask, like, why is it that you ask about cloud migration? And then they said, oh, well, we're going to migrate, and this role that we're recruiting for, is going to be having a large part to play in that. And a percentage of that hands-on. And I was like, wow, okay. But, and you live and learn, like, maybe that's what interviews are for. You do learn more details, of course, about the interviews. But I think I just found myself going to these interviews thinking it's just not fitting. It's just not sitting right. And I think what was forgotten is that it goes both ways. I think interviews should go both ways. I think it's not just about, is this person a good fit for our organisation? It's very much, is this organisation, a good fit for me? And that's how I approach each job prospect. And the answer was no, categorically across the board. And so I took a step back again in February. Like, I decided to stop, and give myself a bit of time, a bit of space. It had only been like a couple of months before when I was headlong into trying to purchase an academy, and that would have been me as a business owner. It would have been learning and development. It would have been training, and it would have looked very, very different from, cloud migration. So I had to sort of take a good look at that and think, actually, why is it maybe that I pursued the coding academy like I did? What? And why was I so excited by it? Because I was hugely excited by it. And I think one great question that someone has asked me recently is, what does the work do for you? And I think that's what I kept asking myself, like, what does this work do for me? And I think what the Coding Academy would have done for me is huge. It's it would have given me autonomy, independence. It would have given me leadership. It would have given me an opportunity to coach and train, but as and when I needed to, and as and when I wanted to. It would have given me so much. And I think it's a really important question for anybody looking at a new opportunity. What does the work do for you? And so it didn't take me very long to realise that actually these things that I really loved about the academy and the reason why I went after that, it deserved my respect and it deserved pursuing. And then I started to review and look at all the things that I'd really enjoyed over the last few years. And many of them were about skill development. Many of them were about training and coaching and leadership and growth. And so I thought, yeah, wow, okay, let's lean into this. I thought, okay, if I was to begin my own academy tomorrow, what would it look like? And I thought, yeah, okay, I could coach and train people to code. But then, more importantly, a really interesting thing had started to happen. So over this period of time, and since I left Deloitte, I've connected with lots of people, old friends, new friends, acquaintances, and lots of people have kind of come to me and asked for help. And so I opened up my notebook one day and I just thought, I'm just going to jot down like a few people who've just come to me to ask for help with things. So, for example, I had, Rich, an acquaintance of mine who injured himself really badly. He was basically on crutches for quite a while. And he reached out to me and he said, James, he said, could you put together a training program, like a physical training program that I could do with the minimal kit I've got at home and with a broken foot? So I was like, yeah. So I videoed him a few things in the gym. I, put a few things together for him, sent it across, checked in with him, nudged him every now and again just to see like how often he was doing it. And then Bhavna, I remember Bhavna, who I used to work with at Deloitte, Bhavna got in touch. We went out for a coffee and she said, James, like, tell me more about your data science machine learning course. So we started to talk about this, and then she said, oh, James, like, what about job applications? Like, tell me about the interviews, the technical interviews. So then we started to put together like a program whereby we were meeting every 2 weeks, and we were I was sharing with her, some of the coding interviews that I'd seen, that I'd had, and then talking about maybe coaching Bhavna as to how I would approach different things. And this went on, like other people were reaching out for, far more personal matters. A good friend reached out because his mum was dying. Another person reached out to me because they just found themselves in a rut and just got really stuck and into bad habits. And so I sat there and I wrote out in my notebook, and I thought, wow, if I was to start an academy tomorrow and help to coach people in software or coding, that would be wonderful. But why stop there? Like, is that, yes, I can do that, but just because I can do that, does that mean that I should? Does that mean that that's the best that I've got to offer? And I realised that no, it's absolutely not. When it really comes down to it, I've spent not just 4 years at Deloitte, in a really tough time in my life, but it extends far beyond that. It extends well over 10 years. There have been lots of things, traumatic things that, have happened in my life. And I think we all go through tough times in life. And I feel that, I have the capacity now, and the experience maybe to be able to help other people out who might be going through those tough times. And So I woke up on the anniversary of my mum's death on the 1st of May 2025, 1 year after my mum had died and 11 months after I'd left Deloitte for good. And I wrote an article on LinkedIn and I shared it. And at the bottom of that article, I invited people to grab a coffee with me, just a virtual coffee, just book in and have a chat, just for anyone who might be going through a tough time right now. And people booked in. And I now get to speak to people and get to talk to people, on a daily basis about things that truly matter. And I feel privileged to be able to do that. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity and I take it very seriously. I think what I'm best at is creating a space for people to share, and maybe they can share things with me and work on things with me that they can't share in other areas of their life. And so rather than label myself any type of coach, what I do know and what I realized that I am is a coach. And at any given time, that might be a fitness coach, a health coach, a wellness coach. It might be a life coach, a business coach, an executive coach. But really, it doesn't matter. I think what I love to do and who I am is, first and foremost, I'm a coach who can create a safe space for people to discover what they need at the given time. And that's my story. That's my story so far. So, I'd love for you to share this journey with me. Come on board. And let's see where we go. Thanks for listening.